Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. A very warm welcome to this session on understanding strategic, embedding climate risk management in the strategic planning of international organizations as part of the Berlin Conference on Climate and Security. My name is Ollie Brown. I'm an associate fellow with Chatham House, otherwise known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs, a London-based think tank, and together with another London-based organisation, E3G, we are organising this short webinar to discuss issues around how the international organisational system is set up to deal with climate risk. It's part of a project that we are running that's funded by the UK Foreign Office and that aims to bring together experts from the UK and from China to understand what climate risk means for the world, for the international system of governance, and so on. And what we're trying to do here is to talk about what the international system that we have this web of international organizations, the WHO, International Energy Agency, UNDP, the World Bank, and so on. Collectively, they set the agenda on all sorts of critical issues: health, water, energy, food, and so on. But they weren't designed at the outset to deal with issues around climate change. The challenge is that climate change potentially makes their mission more difficult to deliver, changes the ability of them to operate how they were originally intended. And it begs some really important questions, I think. How are international organizations evolving their strategies to deal with uncertainty and risk? What can be learned from different organizations, from the private sector, from governments, to improve their action on climate change? Basically, are they fit for the purpose they now find themselves confronting? So we want to understand to what extent international organizations have been able to include climate change risks, direct risks, indirect risks in their strategic planning. If you think about it, we talked after the last financial crisis in 2008, 2009 about stress testing banks. And the question is, can we stress test our international system in the face of the climate crisis? To do that, we have some amazing panelists. We have Clarice Wilson, who is a strategic planning advisor with the UN Development Programme and has a lot of experience in terms of moving planning processes through the UN system and helping big organizations achieve the aims they were set up to achieve. We have Richard Smith Bingham, who's the Executive Director of Marsh & McLennan Advantage, and he's also on the advisory board of the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report, and he's a steering group member of the OECD's High-Level Risk Forum. And then we have Alice Hill, who's with the Council on Foreign Relations now, but previously was the Senior Director for Resilience on the National Security Council in the US, and also a Special Assistant to President Obama. We have a fourth speaker, Ibrahim Gora, who I hope is going to join us a little bit later. He is the Head of Strategic Planning for the UN Environment Programme, and he also chairs something called the UN Strategic Planning Network, which is a group of 40, 50 different organizations that get together to discuss how they can make their own planning more effective. Somewhat ironically, he's at the moment in a meeting to sign off the very last sign-off meeting for UNEP's new medium-term strategy, their new strategic plan, with the Executive Director of UNEP. So he's going to try and join us after that, straight from the coalface of strategic planning. So please note that this event it's public, it's on the record, and we will record it for our own, just to sort of capture the information that comes out. The plan is that I'm going to ask each of the panelists a couple of questions in turn, and then open up for questions from you for the last 20 or so minutes. There is a Q&A function that you can write questions in. If you think somebody else's question is particularly interesting, then you can vote on that question, and that'll sort of bump it up the list of questions it will ask. Please identify if there's somebody in particular you'd like to direct your question to. And then, yeah, please do add your questions and we'll get to them at the end. So with that, without further ado, let me start with Clarice. Clarice, you're working for UNDP. By any metric, this is a massive organization. It's working in 177 countries, something like 38,000 staff, an annual budget of approximately US $5 billion. You're working on pretty much every possible development issue there is out there. What are some of the operational challenges that climate change presents to UNDP? And what are some of the challenges that organizations like UNDP face in planning around that kind of uncertainty?
Thanks, Ollie, and good to see you all. So when you think about UNDP, many people might not associate our work with climate change. So it might surprise you that UNDP has the largest climate change portfolio in the UN system, with over $1 billion and hundreds of projects under implementation in over 140 countries. But as you can imagine, there are many operational challenges that come with implementing any climate change portfolio of that size. And I'm just going to pick a few of these, and we can go through them. So after the Paris Agreement, we were all excited that we had a solid multilateral agreement to tackle climate change, and momentum began to build. But we also realized that to limit global temperatures from rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius, we needed to raise the level of ambition. So that was the first challenge. And I'll come back to how we're trying to make our own contribution to this later. But one of the other challenges is that while we're structured to design, deliver, and implement climate change projects with funding that's typically heavily earmarked, it's hard to design for a portfolio, given that there's still sort of a project-specific approach to development funding. And yet, for us, as you mentioned at the beginning, everything is connected. So about 40% of UNDP's programming is in fragile contexts, but the investments in our work are not typically linked to climate change. So we struggle to make the connections ourselves and find the right sources of investment to access that climate approach. But we know that the effects of climate change can intensify resource competition, drive people out of their homes, and trap them in a vicious cycle of vulnerability. So what do we do to make sure that the hard-won gains, development gains, are not eroded, with people slipping back into poverty and facing new forms of vulnerability? We have to embed these climate change solutions within our wider development efforts. So the climate change poverty linkages are complex, multifaceted, and context specific. So designing programs that address uncertainty and vulnerability that are context specific continues to be a challenge, and we're still figuring it out. While we have a large portfolio of projects, it can also be difficult to see the portfolio effects and the totality of what the different actions on the ground amount to in terms of impact at the global level. And constraints that I dare say all international agencies like UNDP experience are that systems that were designed decades ago took a generally linear approach. So it was input, output, outcome, result. And the financing that overlaid that mirrored it. To some extent, the type of funding we receive and that can help countries access, which is critical, determines the kind of interventions we can make. Like all of you, we're constantly dealing with uncertainty, and we're now operating in a completely different environment where countries are demanding increasingly sophisticated solutions that tackle problems at the systemic level. So what we're seeing now requires a much more agile and flexible approach that allows for experimentation and to deploy a whole host of different solutions with room to fail and to pick up the ones that have potential to scale. And we're definitely not there yet. A final challenge I'd like to touch upon is capabilities. So we're conscious that different skills are now required within UNDP. For example, horizon scanning, futures thinking, planning for uncertainty, sensing, and networking are much more important now, and they're not the domain of one unit in the organization, as has traditionally been the case. It needs to be much more widely distributed. Those are just some of the challenges we're facing now, and I'll stop there and let others come in.
Clarice, that's excellent. That's really interesting. I mean, this issue around the sort of old linear system of input, output, and the way that perhaps the funding still goes around that, moving into this situation where you have much more complexity, and how you deal with that, what the capabilities need to be to deal with that. I think this is something that I think Richard and Alice are going to come to as well. But just on that sort of issue, what are you're talking about some of the capabilities you want to have in place, and some of these new sort of slightly buzzy word ideas of horizon scanning and networking and all of these distributed capabilities that you want to have across an organization as big and dealing with as complex issues as UNDP. What is UNDP actually doing to try and plan around this, to try and plan for this kind of risk and uncertainty? Can you give us some real sort of tangible examples that might be relevant to other international organizations?
Sure. So a few years ago, at the beginning of our current strategic plan, we began a transformation to become futures ready. And as part of that transformation, we're doing two things. So our administrator, Achim Steiner, began what we call the Future of Development series, where he brings together different thinkers and experts that you would not ordinarily expect an organization like UNDP to be talking to, so our uncommon bedfellows, to have what are essentially mini labs on some of the big issues of today and tomorrow and what we should be planning for in the future. It's a way to expand our universe, challenge our assumptions and stress test ideas. So the latest iteration of that is captured in a paper co-written with Indy Johar of Dark Matter Labs, entitled A Way Forward. And it's an expedition into looking into the future of governance, because one of the things that we're talking about is that, or one of the sort of arguments is that climate change is in essence a governance problem. And what we're trying to do is make sense of the changes taking place today, and partly triggered by COVID-19. So the series is a frame to consider the choices the world collectively faces, and a recognition that we're operating in a new context of shared vulnerabilities, climate change exacerbating that, and we have shared risks and interests which will require new models of societal and transnational innovations, knowing that the mere response to an immediate set of cascading crises is not enough. And I'm happy to share the paper through you if there's interest. But taking it from sort of the global level to the ground, in 2019, we set out to build the world's largest and fastest learning network on wicked sustainable development challenges. So we call it the UNDP Accelerator Lab Network, and it's covering 78 countries and expanding. The labs are set up to address problems and uncover solutions where they are at the local level. And we brought in a whole new set of skills into the organization that actually also required sort of new HR functions, with job titles like head of local exploration, head of experimentation, and head of solutions mapping. So it's allowing room to experiment and fail. And it's part of how we're changing mindsets on our work on the ground from within, as culture eats strategy for breakfast. So those are just a couple of the ways in which we're trying to build sort of the planning for uncertainty, and also reskill and bring in new sort of expertise into the organization. Over.
Interesting. So bringing together people who don't normally talk, and then bringing in external expertise from outside. This job title of head of experimentation sounds like a great job to have. Sounds really fun. Thank you, Clarice. That's really interesting. Now, what I want to do is I want to turn to Richard. Richard, you spend your time advising companies and governments on how to better anticipate and respond to new complex threats. Climate change one, health threats another, which we're living through right now, cybercrime and so on. You sit on the advisory board of the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report, which I guess is the sort of yearly annual temperature check of what people think are the major risks facing the world. And you're a steering group member on the OECD's High Level Risk Forum. Why do organizations find it hard to deal with risk at a strategic level? What are some of the challenges that you see either private sector, international organizations or governments facing?
Great, thank you, Ollie, for that, and indeed for inviting me to this discussion. And I think some very interesting challenges that have been raised by Clarice already. Indeed, so my reference point is very much large corporations and individual governments. And I think the fundamental challenge is that most organisations, as we know, like a pretty deterministic view of the future that enables them to apply resources to certain goals with a strong sense of the expected outcomes around that. And if they have to deal with risk, they like it neatly packaged so that they can establish a clear business case for the mitigation effort, and then they can implement accordingly. But as we know, these sort of big risks that are facing governments, businesses, and societies don't actually conform to that at all. So from an organizational perspective, climate change, as we understand it now, in that very sort of broader definition that Greece was touching on, presents many problems as a risk. And perhaps I can touch on three. I think the first really is that there are too many possible futures here. The science may have become more authoritative and the messaging may have become more focused, but from an organizational risk management perspective, the challenge has arguably become more convoluted and more difficult. I think second, because climate change is a force multiplier, its impact for organizations is clearly multidimensional, often with those interlocking drivers and second and third order consequences across the entire ecosystem on which organizations are dependent. And of course, these ecosystems at the moment, or many of them, are hugely stretched, and all force multipliers are acutely felt at this time of significant stress and shifts and possible inflection points, be they societal, economic, industrial, and geopolitical, or whatever in nature. So, for example, at what point does this, from a business perspective, affect the stability of markets that a business is maybe operating in, or indeed, perhaps in due course, is licensed to operate in those markets as well. I think third, because resilience imperatives, however they may be defined against these different dimensions of the risk, of climate risk, they're becoming increasingly blurred with transition imperatives, which of course have their own different calculus at the same time. So I think that as a consequence of this, some organizations, still, or some businesses still experience a lot of discussion about issues and don't actually focus hard enough on materiality, consequence, and response over medium and longer term planning and investment horizons. And I think it's easy to disappear down rabbit holes and get lost in the weeds or the noise if you confuse contextual risk with risks to the achievement of your own goals. Or sometimes they'll place sort of a complex risk in a singular position on a heat map, in other words, likelihood versus impact, when actually that risk, quite frankly, could appear anywhere on that heat map, or even on several heat maps, depending on what it is actually influencing. And when they do that, they're often parking the risk where they would like it to be, rather than where it ought to be. I think also some organizations express a considerable concern about the analytical and quantification challenges, as though precision is a prerequisite for action. And my sort of take on this is that a lot of the challenge is actually cultural, and certainly we see companies gradually coming to terms with the need to make big decisions in a timely way under conditions of uncertainty, where the data is inevitably patchy or contested. And I sort of think it's sort of ironic that this hunger for more certainty in the form of stronger proof can sort of sap energy from the need for good judgment and decision making on key threats at a time of less uncertainty, but when more options are on the table in terms of responses.
Thank you very much, Richard. I really like this idea of the way that, I mean, what you're doing is you're echoing, I guess, a lot what Clarice was talking about in terms of how people used to see it as resources to goal, and you package the risk and you see it as a discrete thing. But some of the challenges that there are just so many features to deal with. I just wanted to just come in, if I may, just on this question of you were talking about how people put risk where they want it to be rather than where it is properly? Do you think people in general understand risk?
I think probably, not really, or not properly. And I think, again, I think in some ways that is also a rabbit hole to to go down as well here. And I think it is, I think in some ways, we are still, you did mention the financial crisis at the very beginning there, but I think in some ways, a lot of the risk management rigor that was introduced after the financial crisis was sort of, fighting the old war of the financial crisis, and actually the complexities of the risk issues that companies need to deal with, and other organizations need to deal with, argue for a very different way of doing that. And I think the old thing of, impact and likelihood is, it runs out of road quite quickly in terms of being able to think about that. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll just say to everybody, if you do have questions, please do just put them straight into, there's a Q&A box there. So please add your questions. We're seeing some really interesting questions coming in. If you want to upvote those questions, you can press the little Facebook thumbs up thing next to it, and we'll focus on that. We'll come back to those questions at the end, but please keep on adding your questions. For Richard, sort of following on from what you were saying, can you give us some examples of the ways in which organizations have dealt successfully with these kind of risks?
Yeah, I've been talking with organizations for a bunch of years now about dealing with these complex risks. And I think the first thing is that there's nothing like a clear-cut, multifaceted crisis to elevate the imperative and expose the shortcomings of existing arrangements and to encourage new thinking. So if anyone can think of one of those, then do please, let me know. But I think, seriously though, I think the organizations that do this best show a preparedness to cut to the chase and are clear about the rationale for their decision making. And I think, Alice will probably come on to this in terms of a particular example in due course. And I'm largely talking here about organizations that are solving for climate change or similar risks, rather than setting out to solve those risks, themselves. I think the first thing is that they sort of very much acknowledge, climate risk as a distinct concept from the top, but look at it how it is changing other risks and the risk landscape as a whole. They can then embed it both within and throughout their enterprise risk framework, rather than having it as a standalone issue to one side or within the framework where it can easily be ignored, labeled too hard, or oversimplified. I think they need to be sort of canny, they're canny about analytics, assessing how they would fare under clearly scoped, reasonable worst case scenarios that are relevant for them. And then they can factor in those interlocking upstream and downstream dependencies and knock-on consequences, rather than trying to analyze the hell out of everything. And then they can some of them making initiatives like the TCFD climate risk framework their own, and they're leveraging new tools that enable them to link the big picture to specific needs. And indeed, we've just developed one of those with UNEP, so that its finance initiative members can assess climate scenario impacts on lending portfolios. Then I think they ensure that the nature of the risk and the materiality, guide action. So they can determine where they will boost crisis preparedness to be able to move decisively and confidently in the face of fast-moving events. Where they will deploy broad-based resilience measures, hedging insurance, redundancies, etc., in a more cost-effective manner, and where they will engage in preemptive strategic adaptation, so a clear decision framework. And lastly, I think they will also look for, double dividends in terms of their risk management efforts. In other words, energy companies selling assets to resolve short-term liquidity issues and support longer-term strategic reorientation. Consumer goods firms, addressing strategic risks and strengthening their brand, at the same time. Government stimulating fresh investment in a downturn and boosting longer-term decarbonisation and resilience. So I think, in short, and to pick up on what some of what Clarice was saying, they're forward-looking and supple in the way that they absorb new intelligence and recalibrate risks and opportunities, and then with the appropriate governance arrangements that can accommodate this as well.
Very interesting. I love this idea of double dividends and how you've got examples from consumer goods and examples from governments, and perhaps we can start thinking about what some of these double dividends would be for international organizations. Richard, thank you so much for that. I'd like to now turn to Alice Hill. Alice, you worked in the White House under the last administration, where you were the Senior Director for Resilience on the National Security Council. So you were right at the absolute heart of some of these discussions around national security priorities. We're having this meeting in the context of the Berlin Conference on Climate Security, and perhaps you more than anyone else were responsible for getting the US national security infrastructure to take on the issue of climate change and take the issue more seriously. I was wondering if I could get you to give us some insights into your own experience of getting this entire, one of the biggest single organizations in the world, I guess the US military and associated institutions. What was your experience of getting them to take on and integrate the issue of climate change into their own planning and operations?
And E3G for having me here in this wonderful panel. We did try. I don't want to declare victory, but we certainly, President Obama recognized the risks to national security posed by climate change. And as a result of the need to make sure that the science that the federal government in the United States produces, which gives us a lot of information about the climate risks ahead, is incorporated into the intelligence agencies who analyze what will happen, conflict, other stresses in the world, and then inform policymakers, including and strategists, including in the Department of Defense. He signed an executive order that basically required that kind of mainstreaming through the Department of Defense. Similarly, and I think Clarice is right, a lot of this is a government problem in terms of driving policy. Similarly, he signed an executive order requiring that all of the United States international development investments, so through its aid agency, as well as through the multilateral development banks, the contributions it makes there, all of that had to be screened for climate resilience. So for the purpose of that is you don't want to build a bridge that is not going to withstand future flooding or establish a malaria program that is not going to cover the proper geographic zone. So 2 executive orders, new president. We had only a 50% success rate on those. President Trump almost immediately pulled the executive order on national security and climate change. And so there is currently no requirement within the federal government that either our intelligence agencies or our defense forces plan for climate change. The international development work survives, and that has been implemented across all of our programs so that we are successfully mainstreaming considerations of climate risk as we make investments overseas that we deem in our strategic interest or for whatever reason we choose to make. Interestingly, once President Trump pulled that order on national security and climate change, our US Congress stepped in. And on a bipartisan basis, and I'm sure many of you are aware that we have, as many countries do, a highly polarized electorate right now. We have an election coming up. Only one party, the Democratic Party, even has a platform on climate change. The Republican Party does not. So, but Congress, on a bipartisan basis, told the military, you need to do a better job. And in 2 primary areas. The first is this kind of looking at climate change as a strategic risk. So they've recently required that Department of Defense run a working group, essentially like the working group the executive order called for, looking at what does this mean for the military? What will it mean for acquisitions? What will it mean for their strategic posture, their planning, and decisions going forward? It also required preparation of our installations. The United States, one of the greatest military powers in the world, has over 1,700 military installations. About 2/3 of those are threatened by climate change. And that's also something that Congress has driven. Congress has told the military, you need to understand these risks to your installations and what that could mean to your operations. And there's a very dramatic example of that in the United States, and that's our Norfolk military installations. That's along our eastern seaboard. It's the world's largest naval base, and all of our branches of our military service, Army, Marine, Navy, have a presence there. We have 30 installations. But that area is suffering from one of the highest sea level rise rates in the world, and certainly the highest on the East Coast, which has profound impacts for its ability to operate. Most of the personnel live off base, 90%, and so we have sunny day flooding. That's when it's really bright and sunny out there, but there's a big tide, and so it disrupts transportation within the surrounding area, meaning that our military personnel can't get on base, which could have significant security risks for us. And there are other installations that we've had tremendous losses in. We have an Air Force base that we lost every single building during a hurricane. And then we have another Marine base that was heavily damaged just in 2018, $8 billion worth of damage to 2 facilities. So going forward, I think no matter what the outcome of the election will be, Congress will continue to press the military to take this seriously. But we have challenges there because militaries, as many corporate organizations, are hierarchical. And if your chief, in our case, the president, says that climate change is a hoax, there's less incentive for planning in a serious way. Because if you're a lower level military service person, you're not going to go off on your own and start planning for climate change when there's no single signal from the top. So that will remain a Achilles heel for us until we can have a clear signal that it needs to be mainstreamed throughout the organization and needs to be at the essence of all decision making. Essentially, as in a corporation, whatever decision you're making, there needs to be someone asking the question, does climate change the calculus on this? Is this investment sound in the face of what we have projected for risk? There is deep uncertainty here, but one thing we are very certain of is we will continue to heat up. We will continue to have sea level rise. So for organizations, for their operations and choices going forward, there are material questions that are already ripe for decision. But unless somebody asks it in the room, it doesn't get considered. And in fact, that's the reason why this National Security and Climate Change Order was developed, because the question wasn't being asked. I would be in the Situation Room and nobody's raising climate, but you're seeing events unfold across the world, Syrian refugees at the doors of Europe, and the question of what does the drought mean in terms of the flow of migrants? What does the drought mean in Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua for US southern border for the flow of migrants going forward? What does that mean for our personnel to be able to operate in extremely hot conditions? Can our planes fly if it's really hot? How long does the runway need to be? All those questions need to be asked, and they weren't yet. So the goal is to make sure that's happening, and I think Congress has signaled very strongly to the Department of Defense they want those questions answered. They don't think this is wise to leave our security vulnerable to a growing risk.
And if I can just dig in on that. It's really interesting, and sort of understanding and hearing a little bit more about this dynamic between the military and Congress and the president is so relevant to, I guess, this question of leadership and how leadership plays out. You were talking a little bit about the order having to come from on top, but if I could just ask about your own experience, when there was that order from on top, did you find the military apparatus was sort of inclined to see, did they just recognize that there were security issues there, and did it jive with their experience in your experience of speaking to the military people? Because they are, they spend their time thinking about risks and hopefully in an objective way. Was it something that was well received by them at that time?
Well, I think anyone who's worked in a large bureaucracy knows that an order can come from on top, and there can be people who act with alacrity, and there are other people who are going to see what happens. And certainly former members of the cabinet of various presidents throughout history have pointed out that sometimes a president gives an order and people just sort of let that wait. I will say, so it was a mixed result initially. I led the meetings to the actual development of the order itself. So the very first meetings, it was, the body language was very poor. People were sitting back like, you know, crossed arms. What is this? Why do we have to do it? We don't need to do it. This is, climate is, you know, it's not happening, whatever. Over time, when you force people to look at the projections, look at what we're learning, every single one of our security agencies, and we have over 20 in our federal government, it's very dispersed, every single one of them agreed and said, yes, we need to do this. We recognize that this is a risk to our national security. So we got agreement within the top leadership of all of these agencies, including their political, and then the people who have made their careers within the government. I will tell you anecdotally, as I've gone and spoken to members of the military, it is mixed. The military reflects the political beliefs of our nation, and this has become a political issue, whether you believe in climate change or not. It's not a political issue, the science is there. But there are some who view it as a political issue. So there's a story of a young service officer saying, well, I get what you say, but you know, I'm trained to take the hill. So which hill do you want me to take in this fight against climate change? And as Clarice and Richard have alluded to, this is a different kind of risk. It's not an enemy. There's no person pushing a button as there is with nuclear war. There's no terrorists coming across the border. This is a risk that will just accumulate on its own and stress all of us and stress all of the systems that we rely upon, because we built those systems assuming that we have a stable climate. We do not have a stable climate anymore, and those systems are under great stress, and many will crumble in face of new extremes. So it's a difficult mindset, and certainly with President Trump, there has been little training of personnel on these issues. So we have a cadre of people coming up through the ranks who do not have the necessary education on the issue of climate risk. And that is, I think that's true at all levels, including in corporations. This issue wasn't a part of schooling for many of the people who lead these organizations. They've had to learn from news what climate change means or whatever briefings they get. And that's a really hit or miss proposition. So you find some discount the risk in ways that do not match what the science already is very clearly stating will occur. And that is an uphill climb. When we get a younger generation in here at the helm, I think it'll move much more quickly.
Very interesting. I mean, and this question about education and how it plays out. So your experience in trying to get the US security apparatus take this on is tremendously interesting, and it sounds like a huge challenge. What advice would you have for international organizations like UNDP or UNEP or the World Bank or other organizations looking ahead to their own operability in a +2, +3, +4 degree world? How can they make sure they're fit for purpose? What advice would you have for them?
Well, I think Clarice and Richard have touched on the basic components. First, you have to look at your own operations, and that's your physical assets as well as your global supply chain. We've seen that with the pandemic. It is difficult to model these things, but there are modelers who are moving out in the private sector in particular, who are looking at how you can look at cascading impacts to infrastructure and what that could mean for your own operations. Probably the best developed, I think, in the supply chain world, but looking at, you know, if your energy grid fails, as it is in the state of California, because we're having shutdowns preemptively because of wildfire risk, what does that mean for your company? You need a set of generators. Do you need to move operations somewhere else? And asking those kind of questions. And then I think it requires education across the all organizations. And I think this is one of the climate change, one of the difficult things. Climate change is nuanced. And so I'll see publications saying tornadoes, which we are seeing changes in tornadoes within the United States. They're moving further east in the United States to communities where they have not historically been. But the climate science doesn't say that's because of climate necessarily. It's a risk we need to be aware of, but it gets pretty confused as people say this. So we just need education on what's happening and what are the risks that are going to occur. And then we need a message from on top that this has to be a part of every decision-making process, and we need accountability for that. So there needs to be a system that's checking whether people are actually doing this or not, and that depends, you know, their performance rests on whether climate is considered. I think basic elements of driving mainstreaming climate risk into decision-making, that's where we are, and that's where we need to, that's the road ahead, and so we need to take very basic steps to ensure that that occurs.
That is great. Leadership, accountability, education. I think that's coming out very, very strongly. Thank you very much. What I wanted to do now was to go to some of the questions that we have. Again, please do add if you have any more questions that, as they come up. We have about 17 minutes left. We have a strong request for your way forward paper, Clarice, so we can circulate to the group. And I wanted to ask a question from Elodie de Wallencourt to Clarice. Asks, what is UNDP using to map climate risks at a country level and to prioritize them? 177 countries, your climate portfolio in 140 different countries. How are you actually understanding where to put your resources?
Thanks, Ollie. So one of the things that we're doing, so structurally we have a crisis bureau that has climate risk people sitting in it. But one of the things that we did at the end of 2019 was to launch something called the Climate Promise. And what it is that we have 114 countries that we support to enhance the ambition on their nationally determined contributions. And within that, we advocate for an inclusive approach to ensure climate ownership across climate actions, across government and society to advance equality, strengthen social and environmental sustainability. And part of that support also includes generating data and evidence across this work. And this is key. I know we've talked a little bit about, you know, all the science out there that can be confusing, but this is at the country level. Because we're working across 170 plus countries and territories, we're able to conduct an analysis and feed it back to sectoral ministries to consider in their national strategies and plans. So it's sort of two things: working with the governments to make sure that whatever's being planned is being incorporated within their broader strategies, and then providing that climate risk information. As I said before, we work a lot in fragile contexts, and we sort of have to have this iterative process of constantly recalibrating, making sure that we're looking at different parts and making the connections, because often when you work with governments, it's still sectoral, you still have your line ministries. So it's not perfect. We're still also revising our risk framework, because before we had this sort of traditional risk log where people at the beginning of a project would create their risk log and then never look at it again until it became an issue. So Richard, you alluded to this earlier, and we're still sort of in that space where we have these contingency plans, And then the only time we see that risk again is when it's escalated into an issue. So there are still things that we're working on around that. We're redesigning our risk frameworks. We're actually revamping our ERP at the moment as well. So yeah, it's a work in progress, but there are some specific things that we're doing in terms of the climate promises I mentioned, and working directly with the government so that they have ownership. So it's not that we prioritize, we go with their priorities. They decide what they're going to do, and then we provide data and analysis and support them in that way, also with technical support.
And just for those who don't understand the acronym ERP?
Oh, are you testing me, Ollie?
That's fine.
So it's like our corporate planning system.
Right, okay. Okay, very good, very good. Thank you very much. Let me turn to Richard. I have a question here from Anthony, which is, how is the interaction changing between businesses and international organizations on climate change? I mean, you're at this sort of interface of international organizations and business. What can business do to improve the relationship, and what are they looking for from international organizations such as Clarice's?
I think the key thing is that businesses are increasingly aware of their responsibilities and obligations, and the fact that they are more in the spotlight, these days, in terms of their, contribution to, climate change, responses, and indeed, therefore, their positioning within the countries within which they operate. And certainly, as we've seen over the last, year or two, that sort of, ESG and investor agenda has become a lot, it's gathered a lot of momentum, which has increased that scrutiny as well. So therefore, there is that sense of looking for those opportunities that enable them to strengthen their social license to operate, in particular countries, and be able to find the right ways to do that are that are properly accountable, and indeed having positive impact as well. I think looking at it from the other side of the fence, I would say that what businesses always want, and obviously they're struggling to get these days anywhere in the world, is a clear sort of policy climate for being able to do business. And so therefore anything that can help to achieve that level of stability, so they can run businesses, develop businesses with a degree of, and invest with a degree of confidence, is always going to be something that would be certainly regarded as the as a quid pro quo around that.
Thank you, thank you. I have a question to Alice from Melina Mera, who's saying that apparently no US military chief has reported to Congress. We're already talking about Congress, the president, and the US military. No US military chief has reported to Congress this year on security risks facing the US. This is unprecedented in an election year. No one wants to be singled out for criticism by the president. How can you how can you address these sort of failures in political institutions and governance? What should the climate security community be doing to sort of counteract this, would you think?
Well, I don't want to suggest that no testimony has gone before Congress describing the risk. There are hearings. That's why it got into a bill, a legislation that required it. So that's through our National Defense Reauthorization Act. Our Congress, as you know, has been very polarized, but the one place that they always agree on is funding the military. So no politician wants to be out there not voting to fund our military, at least in our political climate. So they do agree, and during the course of that, there is testimony regarding this. But yes, we have a president who says that he was recently reported as saying he believes the Earth is going to cool in the near future, and has repeatedly said that climate change is a hoax. So these are very difficult times for us. It's difficult for us to make progress on climate change. What we've seen, which I think has occurred in other nations, is our subnational. Our cities, our states have stepped up in a big way. Unfortunately, that has put them in conflict with the federal government, the Trump administration, because Trump administration has very determinedly pulled back on the environmental regulations that were put in place to curb greenhouse gas emissions under the Obama administration. There has been a full-on assault by the Trump administration against those regulations. So when states want to insist on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, sometimes there's a conflict with federal law, which has set up a legal battle going forward. And most of these are still, issues are still in our courts being actively litigated. But there is reporting. Our head of intelligence did issue a report saying that climate change was a risk. It did not appear in our national security strategy. It has not appeared in our strategy for emergency management. So it's really a patchwork within the United States, whether climate change is discussed or not. And I agree, that makes us hugely vulnerable to this accumulating risk because we're not addressing it in a frank manner.
Thank you. If I can just follow up on that with another question that's related from Zainab Lokandwala, who's asking these climate risks faced by the US military. What are some of the, how do you find the right terminology to make these politically acceptable? I was asking, does the political establishment call these climate risks or some other type of risk? Is there some other terminology that should be used given how partisan an issue the science around climate change is? Should it be reframed as a risk other than climate change?
Yes, vocabulary has been a tripwire for many discussions. So it's interesting tracking the word resilience, which basically, I think it was a Scottish physician first coined it, in the 1790 or something, and it had a flat usage basically, and now it's soared, and it came from the material sciences and other things, but now it's used broadly in lieu of adaptation because adaptation signals climate change. We've gone from global warming to climate change. What you'll often see now used alternatively is future risk. To try to capture the fact that the risk picture is changing. But we have not settled on a vocabulary that's acceptable. Very commonly, people who work on the issues of climate change, if they go out into communities, they report that they do not use the terminology climate change because it's a lightning rod. Polling in the United States is changing, showing us a change. 70% at least of Americans view climate change as a risk, but there's a very vocal minority that follow the president's view that this is not happening and have a very poor reaction to the use of the term climate change. And that makes planning on a community level fraught with challenges in finding a common terminology to address what the risk is. I think as the impacts increase, and we are obviously having a very big season here, we've had so many named storms, we're into the Greek alphabet, we've had lots of flooding, including sunny day flooding on our eastern seaboard, and then our west coast is just seeing enormous fires that we have never experienced before. So as those impacts come in, even if people dislike climate change, they recognize that the risk picture is changing, but not fully. I definitely, when I write about climate change, people write me back and say, oh, it's not climate change, it's something else, whatever. So I know that there's a lot of resistance to this term. If we could find the right term, that'd be great. The problem is the risk is accumulating. We just need to get busy on addressing the risk, whatever we call it, because we are, with every passing day, we're becoming more vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a question for all three of you very quickly. We've only got 5 minutes left, so we're going to have to zoom through the last questions quite quickly. Lucille Martins asks that, is the functional division of labor between different policy areas, this idea of these different international organizations that we have on health, on agriculture, on water, on energy, and so on, does that constitute a challenge to address climate risks? How do you and your organizations concretely experience these divisions? And also this issue between urgent crises and long-term challenges. So it's a question about silos and a question about timing. Clarice, you probably live this on a day-to-day basis more than most. What's your, if I can start with you, and then we'll go to Richard and then back to Alice.
So this is an issue that's existed since the beginning, right? We started to see interconnections very early on in our work, but the way that governments are structured in their line ministries tended to be sort of challenging to bring them all together into a room. So one of the things that has evolved over time is that we are taking these whole of government approaches, and governments recognize it themselves. It's not to downplay, even though they have sort of systemic challenges that have been built up over time, and it's hard to break down these structures. More and more governments are coming to us for whole of government approaches and bringing in the relevant players. So we have these country support platforms that we're never talking to just one ministry. So while it's still a challenge, I would say that it's not, at least in terms of the ideological sense of it, whilst we're still trying to break down those barriers, governments recognize it themselves. And because they're seeing, as Alice and Richard are saying, the risks evolving in a way that we're like, wait, this is a completely different environment. We can't just say, okay, this is the domain of the Ministry of Finance or whatever in turn. But then we also, which comes to the second question, have this issue of you have people in office for short periods of time that have to achieve something. But the risks that we're looking at, that sometimes you're not going to see the impacts till later. What we're saying to you is, if you don't address this now and assign some resources to it, in a few years from now, maybe when you're out of office, it's going to become a real issue. But to try and get that decision-making done when they have very short terms in office is continuously a challenge. And there are some governments that have specific futures sections, so they're approaching it differently. And there are others that don't. So we still continue to come up against that barrier.
Thank you, Clarice. Before I turn to Richard for some very quick comments, I just wanted to mention, I thought it's interesting, there's been a lot of talk now about the international organizational system becoming weaker and irrelevant, and is the UN relevant anymore? But it's interesting to note, just this week, President Xi Jinping of China announced that China is going to aim to be peak climate emissions before 2030 and become climate neutral by 2060. Where did he do that? At the UN. So international organizations are still, central to this discussion. Richard, what are some of your thoughts about the sort of silos of the international system and short-term, long-term risk? Very quickly, yeah. I'm afraid, because we're just having to close up.
Absolutely. I think that we're certainly in the national resilience work that I'm involved in, there are perhaps three buzzwords. One is, we say, a holistic view of risks. The other of which is all of government, which seems the whole of government. And the third of which is actually all of society, which is actually expressed the fact that responsibilities are much broader than just governments. And in fact, governments cannot solve these issues, by themselves. I think in terms of, thinking about these issues, I think inevitably you're going to have those, vertically oriented, departments and issues on particular agenda. The key thing is to have an absolutely clear as to what those horizontal threads are that run through them and what the obligations are around those threads as well. I think that's sort of the obvious next step beyond the initial philosophy. And I think the third thing is actually, what are those crystal clear cross-governmental, cross-departmental working groups that actually are able to tackle particular issues, develop particular solutions, upstream, downstream policy innovations, investment programs, etc. around that, and are clearly on the hook to do so. I think some of these future-oriented futures departments, I think, are interesting. Sometimes they can be actually quite disconnected from the actual policy making process as well, and don't have the influence that they might, or are positioned to do work on, should we say, positive, futures rather than actually negative, futures, and therefore I think have concerns about the traction that they have.
I'm actually, Alice, if you don't mind, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you a slightly different question in the last 15 seconds, which is, just to finish us off, what would you like to see international organizations doing more of to deal with climate risk? if I can put you on the spot, and then we'll close.
We need to see a mainstreaming of climate risk. It's just that it needs to be one of the considerations going forward. The risk will get larger, and if organizations are not putting in place the planning, the strategic thinking to handle these risks, we will be excruciatingly vulnerable going forward. So you need a policy that says this is important, you're going to consider it, and then you need to have the mechanisms that make sure that happens. In any organization, the urgent often overtakes the important, but we need to carve out the time and the space to make sure that that's considered in the urgent decisions, because sometimes those have long-term implications for climate as well as the important decisions. And that just starts at the top. It's a fundamental principle. We're not going to spend another dime until we are sure that it is climate resilient.
Perfect. That is wonderfully concise. Policy, mechanisms, leadership, making sure the urgent doesn't displace the important. Thank you very much. I apologize to those whose questions we didn't manage to reach. Hopefully you can see some of them. Diego Osorio at CGIAR, who's keen to look for institutions working on complexity theory to resolve problems, a lot of what we've been talking about today. And Simon Burkett, who had an interesting point around how UNEP has dealt with some of these combined issues of risk. Let me thank Anum Farhan for helping to put this together. Our panelists, Clarice, Richard, Alice, thank you very much for sharing your experience, your wisdom. And to all of you participants, thank you so much for joining us. It was wonderful to have your engagement and your questions. We will circulate this paper and please do stay in touch. All the best. Thank you again.